Welcome to Franklin Pierce University. Welcome to President Kim Mooney, to our faculty, students, staff, and those who are joining us via live stream, and community members from the greater Monadnock region. What a beautiful day to gather here on the campus at Rindge for what I know will be an extraordinary conversation about a topic that is dominating the public discourse: civility, the press, and politics. Today's conversation is exactly the kind of conversation that Stan and Sherry Fry established a fund for to promote, and we thank them for their generous support. It is my privilege to welcome to the stage of the Fry Lecture Series Boston Herald Editor-in-Chief Joe Shaka, who is embedded with the Marlin Fitzwater Center for Communication this fall as a visiting Fitzwater Fellow. Mr. Shaka brings with him today nearly 4 decades of journalism experience as a reporter, political columnist, and editor. 2 years ago in this very room, Mr. Shaka received the Fitzwater Medallion for Leadership in Public Communication. We said that he was a disruptor, a leader in the news industry, and the Herald has garnered several national honors during his tenure. Editor and publisher named it one of the 10 newspapers that do it right. And the Associated Press media editors named the Herald Team Innovator of the Year for multimedia integration, including its pioneering internet platform, Boston Herald Radio. Joining Joe Shaka on stage is Jeff Robbins, a First Amendment expert, visiting professor of politics at Brown University, and an attorney with Saul Ewing in Boston. Mr. Robbins has had a distinguished career in government and public service, having served as chief counsel to the minority of the U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and as deputy chief counsel to the minority of the U.S. Senate Governmental Affairs Committee. President Clinton appointed him as a U.S. delegate to the UN Human Rights Commission, and he also has served as president of the World Affairs Council of Boston. His byline can be found heading public opinion articles on American foreign policy for the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, the Times of Israel, and the Boston Herald. Please join me in welcoming Joe Shaka and Jeff Robbins to the Fry Lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Nevius. I think it's a real honor to be here, and I am excited to be here with Jeff, who's my colleague and longtime friend. He's my lawyer. I always travel with my lawyer wherever I go. In the event anything comes up that I have to have resolved, he's here. And it's also much, I think, a better situation to be here in this forum as opposed to having him take my deposition, which I've had happen in the past. It's not pleasant. But Jeff, as Kristen noted, has a tremendous background in law, in government, in public service, and just has a great depth of knowledge. And so I think you'll be very interested in hearing what he has to say. He's also a person, frankly, that to me has somebody that I think of as having among the greatest integrity of anybody I've ever met. He's somebody who is always thinking about the public good, about the public interest, about doing things right. And so he's a tremendous role model for all of you, and I hope you have a chance to meet and talk to him after this is over. We're here to talk about civility and in politics and in the media, and I think that the first thing we need to do is really ask ourselves, what do we mean by civility? What is the definition of civility in this context? And I don't think it applies certainly to protest, right? Because we're in a democracy where people want to express their views, and sometimes that can be very loud and it can be very noisy, but people are trying to make a point. You remember the Sons of Liberty, right, in colonial Boston, when they would rally and they would and they would give speeches against the king, and they would, they wouldn't always use the most polite language or take the most polite tactics. And yet that was the birth of the revolution that gave us our country and our democracy. And I don't think, there were any NPR interviewers having the Sons of Liberty on and saying, so what did you mean exactly when you were burning the stamp tax agent in effigy at the rally? People were very, very boisterous. They were expressing, they were venting. And we know that during the more contemporary times of the Vietnam War and the anti-war protests, there was a lot of really ratcheted up rhetoric, and it was the purpose was to be effective and to express oneself. And you can't ask protesters, well, be polite, be civil, watch your language. Nobody wants violence to be incited or to have something that is going to end up in a dangerous situation, but we are a country that is founded on the ability to assemble, the ability to protest, the ability to say what you believe. So we're not talking about protest, we're talking about civility. We're not even talking about necessarily having to have a public discourse in which we respect our rivals, right? Or our opponents, because respect is something that's earned. You can't order it up. You can't say, well, I'm going to flick a switch and now respect someone that I don't believe what they say. So I think that is not what we're talking about when we talk about civility. I think we're talking about having a public discourse in which we can cut through the noise and be heard, and to hear others, to be able to listen to others. That's what civility, I think, means when we're talking about politics and the media and the public discourse. It's very easy to get sucked into that vortex of hyper-partisan rhetoric and to take sides and to ratchet that rhetoric up. It's very easy for that to happen. We have to resist that temptation. We have to fight that temptation, and even because we know that it won't be effective. If you want to be effective, if you want your points heard, if you want to be a citizen that can have impact or a reporter that can have impact, you have to be heard. And we know what happens, right? When there's a lot of static, there's a lot of noise, what happens? Eventually, people turn it down. They turn it off. And they're not listening. They're not engaging. And that is where we're at, I think, today in terms of the public discourse. And we need to change that. But I would ask you, Jeff, in terms of a definition of civility, what that means to you when it comes in the context of the government and the media.
So, first of all, thank you very much for having us, and it really is an honor to be here, at this amazing place, which I think, I don't know what one has to do to get embedded here, but I wouldn't mind getting embedded here. It beats Iraq, God knows. And to be here with somebody who is such a huge institution in Boston and in the media nationally, exactly because he stands for these old-fashioned values of honesty and care and thoughtfulness in what has become increasingly a Wild West type of environment. The easy way to address your question is by dodging it. And it occurred to me when you were talking that it calls to mind the Kavanaugh hearings. I dare say that most people, the vast majority of Americans, would say that they're in favor of civility. Defining it, and there's a famous Supreme Court justice who, in a pornography case, when asked to opine about pornography, said that, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. I'm not even so sure that we know civility or incivility when we see it. A case in point, apropos of the Kavanaugh hearings, was the reaction that all of us had to some of the different players in the protests. So, for example, the woman, I think her name was Anna Maria Archila, if I'm not mistaken, who confronted Senator Flake in that now famous elevator scene, and who gave him a piece of her mind, culminating with the question, "What are you doing, sir?" loudly, preventing him, in effect, from doing what he so ardently, clearly wanted to do, which was to get the button pressed and get out of there as fast as he could. For some people, that was eloquent protest. For some people, that was uncivil. And therein lies the question. I think it's probably fair to say, I mean, for some people, the sit-ins at senators' offices were perfectly normal, sons of liberty, this is what one does. For a lot of Americans, however, it was a bit too much. It was shrill, it was strident, it was on the other side of the norm. Amy Schumer's raising her hand in defiance while being arrested, you know, that was, from some people's perspectives, a pure and entirely civil thing to do. For others, they were repelled by a wealthy Hollywood comedian whose, raunch-filled routines make her a ton of money, channeling the Black Panthers while being called away. So one of the interesting things about your question is that I don't know that we know precisely what a good definition is, but you're so obviously right that whether it's a media down or populace up, the Roman Colosseum, let's see how many Christians get torn apart by lions today, ethos has really metastasized and broadened and deepened so that we may poo-poo this stuff. We may say, we may turn down the volume. On the other hand, to some degree, it's what Americans seem to want.
But, I have to wonder that, I think we do live in a very hyper-partisan time. There's no doubt about it. We know that how strongly people feel, and we know that in the current political climate in Washington, with the president and with the Congress, that has been ratcheted up. There's no doubt about it. But I wonder whether or not the people sitting in their kitchens having dinner with their families at night are sitting around with their fangs showing and drooling and like hyperventilating breathlessly about every single political issue of the day, or whether that's something that is simply reflected more in the media in terms of how we are reflecting what's going on out there. And that's where, as a journalist, I kind of take my responsibility seriously when it comes to asking myself, are we contributing to ratcheting up that rhetoric? Are we contributing to that sense that the country is so bitterly divided and that people that have lost all notion of common sense and just come down with the talking points based on their ideology or their party or whether they're conservatives or liberals? I sometimes wonder whether or not we missed the boat in the media. And maybe we missed the boat in terms of predicting Trump's election because we just couldn't see it. We didn't see it coming. The media is based in Boston and New York and Los Angeles. And the Midwest is sort of a big, vast area where there's not a lot of that crosstalk that goes on with the media elite. And so Trump was able to, I think, capitalize on that and build a base. And he continues to try to keep that base together by ratcheting up that rhetoric himself. And the press plays into that, I think.
Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons I regard you as such a remarkable, important figure is that you are so old-fashioned in a magnificent way, despite all the pressure to kind of around us to behave like we're in a Cuisinart. You basically stand very strong in insisting on certain values in this newspaper of yours that you run so well. I wonder, however, if others are quite as scrupulous as you are or as concerned about the ultimate public good as you are. There must be, in the meetings that take place in Fox and MSNBC and CNN every day, discussions about giving the American people what they want, which is these, the television is just full all day long, 24/7 of people yelling at each other or at least disagreeing with one another loudly. They book these people so that they will disagree with one another. They call back the guests who interrupt others. And I'm sure everybody watching this today or here or listening remotely have seen chunks of TV time where you literally cannot even hear who is speaking. The moderator stands there or sits there, or the anchor person sits there while people are kind of yelling at one another. And this happens day in and day out. My point, I guess, is that somewhere within those news organizations' offices every day there is data which shows them that that is what their viewers across America want.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that we hear the term fake news, and we hear it used a lot. And people say, "Well, what is fake news? What does that mean?" And really, fake news means whatever you want it to mean. It has become a term that is weaponized, and so basically, if it's something that's attacking me, well, that's fake news. If it's something that's praising me, well, that's the truth. And we know that people, by surveys that have been done recently, that they identify with news that way. If they agree with the story, then they say it's fact. If they disagree with the story, they say it's opinion. And so, we know that catering to those niche audiences does boost ratings, and that boosts revenue. And there's no doubt that that stations are acutely aware of that, and the newspapers are acutely aware of it. We're in a struggling industry, and so anything we can do to build audience and certainly retain audience, we're going to do it. I mentioned to you before, Jeff, that Fox News, when President Obama was in office, and he felt that Fox News was unfair and was not balanced, and that was not giving him the benefit of the doubt on anything, he decided, well, I'm just not going to do any Fox News interviews ever. I'm just going to do every other television network's morning shows, Meet the Press, Face the Nation, CNN, MSNBC, but not Fox News. But then a funny thing happened. Fox News's ratings spiked. They went to the highest they'd ever been. And everybody took note and said, well, how could that be? Obama is not speaking to them. But that's the very reason why that happened, because people out there, a certain audience said they must be telling the truth if he won't speak to them. And so now it became a niche station for those people who felt that they were part of the resistance at that time. And now we're seeing CNN, MSNBC, replicating that in terms of ratings as the resistance to Trump. When the Washington Post, which is a great newspaper with great journalists, I know people there, I think it's a tremendous publication, but when they say democracy dies in darkness, well, that's a slogan. Dean McKay from the New York Times said it sounds like a Batman Returns movie. But democracy dies in darkness. What is that? Is it about journalism, or is it about marketing? Is it about sloganeering? And so we're in an environment where there's a perfect storm. We have a struggling media that wants to build an audience. We have the ability to exploit the partisan divide and to build on the sometimes entertaining, sometimes outrageous, sometimes despicable comments that the president will make.
Something has changed, though. If anybody had said 3 years ago, let's say, that you could have, and I'm trying to lay this out in a nonpartisan way, in a clinical way, that you would have a president who had a huge amount of money, massive amount of money, or was not quite telling the truth about that, who refused to release his tax returns, having said he would, who had gotten caught on tape bragging about his ability to assault women's body parts, and who had been so clearly aligned with, sympathetic to, cooperative with, you name it, with a country that was a hostile foreign power. And that candidate / president could essentially deflect that as far as a big chunk of America, maybe half of America, was concerned, by saying some variant or another of fake news. We would have laughed and we would have said, you've got to be kidding. That is never going to work. And the truth is, the fact that it has worked and continues to work says something, I think, about the way that he and others know is the reaction to the American media. Why is it that the American media, that your profession, which works for, which is underpaid, works extraordinarily hard under adverse circumstances to try to tell the truth about stories that are important to our civic life, can get vilified so successfully for doing its work. I wonder what you think if something has happened here in America, some divide between Americans and the media, which has somehow spun out of control.
Well, I mean, I think there are several factors there. I think one thing is that there are a lot of people out there that have never trusted the press. And I think lawyers are even actually higher in terms of public trust and credibility.
That can't possibly
be. We're down
be
there with car salesmen, nothing to reflect poorly on car salesmen, but that people have always distrusted the press and felt that they were hiding something. And it's human nature, I think. So Trump was building on something that already existed. And I think that there was a feeling among people, nobody cares about us. Nobody hears us. The people at the New York Times and the Washington Post are at the same cocktail parties as the government officials that they cover, and they travel in the same social circles, and they never come to our community. They don't know about us. They don't know about what's important to us. And to some degree, they were right. A lot of people in journalism, I think they talk to other journalists. They talk to other editors, but they're not out talking to the average person out there in the street to find out what is important. Maybe they care about college tuition. Maybe they care about meeting the grocery bill, having enough money in their 401k to retire sometime. Maybe trying to work just one job instead of 3 jobs. Maybe health care to cover their chronic illness, that prescriptions are through the roof. And people feel that they've been forgotten. So President Trump was able to build on that by saying, I hear you. And he still does that today. It's a great tactic as a communicator that he is, when he's under fire, he'll go out and he'll tweet something, change the conversation. He'll go out to a rally. Unlike Richard Nixon, who in the final days was talking to portraits of former presidents, Trump is out there. And you look at the faces of the people behind him, they don't look like crazy people. They look like ordinary people in their community. They may cringe just as much as you and I do when he says something, but there was one fellow I saw interviewed after a rally and a reporter went up to that guy and said, what do you think so far about Trump? And he said, I think it's great. He came in like a wrecking ball, and that's exactly what we needed. Yeah. And so he can't, as far as they're concerned, they will put up with the rhetoric, they'll put up with the language, they'll put up with the rudeness, they'll put up with being unpresidential, the attacks, the constant punching and counterpunching and punching and counterpunching, because they believe he's shaking things up and that he's hearing them.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the things, I guess I think that there is a big chunk of America that not only is prepared to put up with the attacks on the press, but at some level thrills to it. That there's something visceral at a gut level that causes a lot of people to associate the press with a foreign power at this point as much as Russia. That whether it's the perception that they think that they're better than us, look at them talking down to us, they're not like you and I, they don't really care about us. Part of the rage, part of the incivility, if you will, that we're seeing in society is a rage, a portion of it is, that is directed at the media and those who get enraged think the media is associated with, which complicates all this tremendously.
And that's what concerns me. It is, when you look at the Gallup surveys and the fact that they are measuring the lowest level of public confidence and trust in the media ever since they began doing those surveys. Post-Watergate, those numbers were pretty high. 70-something% of the American public trusted the media because they saw the press, Woodward and Bernstein, the Washington Post doing something heroic, speaking truth to power, and not being afraid, and basically essentially removing what was a corrupt president as far as the Post was concerned and some of the things that occurred, abuse of power. And now it's fallen dramatically. And so that concerns me. I don't, as a journalist, to me, the most important thing is not how many clicks you get on a story, although that's important for revenue, and not, how many, what the ratings are, but it's keeping faith with the news consumers, keeping faith with the readers, that they trust us, that they believe, because credibility is our stock and trade. It's the most important thing we have. So to me, I spend my time focused on what can we do, and maybe it is some of those old-fashioned ideals. Okay, let's take that apart. Objectivity. Okay. There is a school of thought today that journalists don't need to be objective. That, in fact, they can believe something is true, and then they can build a narrative around that. They can get people to back up their theory, and if they know something is wrong, then it's their duty to point it out and not to get the other side, not to have balance, because we all know that no one is truly objective. I have my views. I suppress them as a professional reporter and go out and try to reflect something that's fair and accurate. But, Jeff, do you think that objectivity is possible? Do you think it's necessary when it comes to journalism?
I think it's possible. I think it's necessary. I try to imagine how we get out of what feels, I hate to be a downer, like a downward descent in terms of the anger and the rage and the polarization and the vitriol of civic life, that to the extent that we can pull ourselves out of it, assuming that's possible, that it falls to the few like you who puts his feet down and says, I don't care what is raging around me. I am going to insist on balance in stories. I'm going to insist on proper sourcing. I'm going to insist on, adherence to these old-fashioned values. I do worry that the pressures that you and your people in your industry are under, coupled with a society that around you that you see really doesn't necessarily want objectivity, is not going to necessarily click or buy, papers if what they're buying is objectivity. The pressures on the likes of you, the dwindling likes of you, to stand athwart that and say, no, for the length of time that I'm doing this, I'm going to stick to those old-fashioned values. Well, those pressures are really tough, as I don't need to tell you.
No, they are, absolutely. You and I have discussed that many times as we've confronted issues like that at the Herald. And, it's to be able to talk to reporters and say, listen, you have to have more than one source. You have to. I know you have a source you trust, but we need to have multiple sources. That's the standard, multiple anonymous sources. Because, the reader can't judge the credibility of something that is a blind quote by someone. And yet we see today single anonymous sources. Part of it is a symptom of social media. A source told me X, a source told me Y. Mainstream media picks it up, and they run with it. And suddenly, this story is getting traction based on a single anonymous source. We have no idea if there even was a source. And you and I have talked about the legal ramifications of sourcing.
Yeah.
When a judge will say, who's the source?
What are the sources?
And you won't say, and then it's like, well, then pretend there was no source. So, that is something that's a hard sell to reporters to say, I know that's true, I know that story, I have this person telling me it, why can't I run that story? But, again, you've got to focus on credibility. Look at that New York Times op-ed written by the senior White House official. And that person may very well have been a senior White House official, but we don't know because we don't know who that person was. And we don't know what motivated that source. And so, when you're dealing with sourcing, you want to know what the motivation is. So as a reader, I could read that story about the tumult in the White House and, people trying to prevent Trump from making decisions and this kind of resistance internally. And I'm saying, well, is that some bureaucrat at the State Department or is it a cabinet member? I don't know what the senior official means. What's that person's motivation? Was that person passed over for a job? Was that person a Clinton loyalist who is embedded there? Without knowing those facts, I take 10 points off credibility before I even begin reading it, at least 10 points. And so, that has become the norm, anonymous sourcing, single anonymous sourcing, it's a problem.
So let me ask you, you have this phenomenon of trust in the media plummeting, stoked, I would say, by all of the attacks on the media. Basically, you've got people, and we know who they are, not only encouraging Americans to distrust the media, but imploring them to do it and demanding that they do it in ever more vitriolic terms. I may be a naif, but I don't see a media which is corrupt. I mean, there are issues along the way, but I don't see the mainstream American media as deserving of this vitriol. But there you are, and you're subjected to it nonetheless. Is it even within the power of the mainstream media, the venerable institutions like yours, to do anything about the mistrust that's directed at them, or are you pretty much helpless and you have to ride with it?
I mean, I think it starts with each individual reporter, each individual editor in terms of their own conduct and their own mission, their own sense of mission. So yeah, I think that, that we can start to regain some credibility where it's been lost. I don't like the attacks on the press. I don't take them personally. And I think that, Trump is not the first politician to attack the press or go to war with the press. Remember Spiro Agnew and the nattering nabobs of negativism. It's something that has always been used as a tactic by elected officials, by politicians. Trump has done it particularly effectively, again, because he's playing to a base of people that believe it is true. And we know, and we did Franklin Pierce polling, and you could see in the last presidential election where he was out there saying, crooked Hillary, crooked Hillary, crooked Hillary, lying Hillary, crooked Hillary. And we saw the numbers starting to turn where people felt that Hillary had a trust problem. They couldn't put their finger on what it was, but they just knew that there was something that she probably did illegally or something, and it was because of that negative, constant pounding that was happening. So it's the same situation with the press. The more you continually say, fake news, they're out to get me, they're out to get me, it's a witch hunt. To a certain degree, he's insulating himself because anything that is written about him, he will say it's fake news, it's a witch hunt, and a certain percentage of people will believe it. But it also more dangerously further erodes public confidence in the press. I think that's the dangerous thing. The press is a very important institution to our democracy. We cannot allow the news media or journalists to lose faith with their readers, and we have a role as journalists to try to prevent that and not feed into it.
Yeah, I worry, and again, I realize I expressed this worry veering dangerously close to seeming partisan. I don't mean to be. But I worry about the media's ability to right the trust issue of its own accord. If, for instance, you have a news media which reports on the fact that tax returns are not released under circumstances which are eyebrow-raising, and nobody cares, then what is the press supposed to do? I mean, they have done their job. They have done it well. They're reporting accurately, clinically, on an important issue. And if it doesn't land because 50% of Americans, I don't know, think that it's a bunch of nonsense, the running room that the media has to improve the trust situation is considerably shrunk because you worry that there's nothing they can do.
But I think that that the role of a journalist is not to worry so much about what the reaction is as opposed to the importance of telling the story. And so obviously we want stories that are going to impact people, change policy, change things, fix things, throw a spotlight on abuses. That's what we do. And as a reporter over decades, I know many times I've written investigative pieces. We spend weeks and weeks and weeks on them. Then we go to the governor or the mayor, and they're like, I didn't read that story. I'm sorry, I can't. I just didn't read it. I didn't read it. I can't comment on it. And you're a little deflated saying, well, he didn't even react to that. Right. But when you look back on it, you say, that story was important to be told. And a lot of people that aren't picking up the phone, calling you, aren't writing letters to the editor, were impacted by it. Mm-hmm. And they're talking to others about it. So got to keep that sense of mission. Let me ask you, you and I have talked a lot about, and again, we're talking about civility here, we've talked a lot about language, loaded language, the power of words. And, you know, you and I have gone over Herald Stories in great detail on deadline many nights. Well, I think it caused me to miss deadline a couple of times, but where you're parsing the words. What does that adjective mean? How is that adjective going to be interpreted? So today, I think that a big problem in the media is loaded language in stories. Saying a politician lied, wrongfully stated, and that's something that as a journalist, again, maybe it's old-fashioned, you know, but my sense was if a politician is not telling the truth, and I believe he's not telling the truth, I will simply reflect what that person says and then present a set of facts to the contrary and then let the readers decide. That doesn't happen today. And today we use those, I mean, I've covered lots of politicians, never accused anybody in print of lying. Yet that's done routinely today. So what about the power of language and the words that we use?
Yeah, I mean, again, all I can do is tip my hat to you because around you is swirling this ever-increasing, ratcheted up tendency to be loud and accusatory and denunciatory and conclusory, like using a word like lie, and you resist it. And my guess is that there are fewer and fewer people like you who are prepared to resist it. I mean, the theory of saying lie, I guess, is, well, listen, I need to get attention here, so I need to ratchet up the noise. One of the points you made earlier is that one of the phenomena when you ratchet up the static is that people will turn down the dial. And so you're committed to simply adhering to these old-fashioned values of, no, I'm going to say what was said, I'm going to recite what the facts are, and I'm going to allow people to draw their own conclusions. A quaint-seeming attitude these days. But I guess I come out thinking that, you know, one of the elements for hope in getting ourselves out of the hole that we societally have dug ourselves into is that there will be leaders like you and institutions like yours that look at this and say, I'm going to stand pat, thank you very much, and I'm going to stick with those old values.
I think, you know, it's probably a good time to start taking some questions, but I will say one last thing before we do that, and that is that, and this is a positive note, the one thing that gives me a lot of hope in the future for both politics and journalism, you know, is when I come to campuses like this and I see students who are engaged and who are thinking and who want to do the right thing. I know that today, as public confidence is the lowest it has ever been in the media, that we're seeing a surge of students who want to be journalists. Many schools are finding journalism programs booked, turning away students. I get resumes from hundreds of people who just graduated or about to graduate. I've actually just hired some, and who are committed to the same principles that I was committed to 40 years ago when I got into journalism. That's a good thing. People want to get into journalism for the right reasons, to protect the public interest, to change things. And I think people want to get into elective office for the same reason. And so that's I think, a positive sign for the future. Whatever the platforms are, whatever the, however news is generated, however it's presented, I think that's the core that is going to save us in the end. So, any questions we can go to?
If you raise your hand, I'll bring the microphone to you. Well, it's for the webcast, too. So.
What's your best advice that you give to students who want to start being a journalist or going into politics?
Journalists, the best advice to students who want to go into either journalism or politics?
Yeah.
Well, it's presumptuous of me to answer that question when Joe Shaka is here. But I guess one thing I would do is to think about going to work for an institution, for a paper, like Joe's. I'm not saying that Joe's is the only one, but that where the leadership is of a quality that really is prepared to stick to the old-fashioned values of writing and not try to take shortcuts, not try to do stuff on the cheap, not try to play to what seems popular or what will get clicks and the rest of it. I think, like with other professions, including law, that the best bet is to go someplace and train with people who are fixated, even obsessed with old-fashioned values and standards, if you'll permit me to sound so old and pompous.
If you want to make a lot of money, you definitely want to go into law. But I think that you have to, first of all, on a personal level, you have to consider the commitment, the personal commitment you're going to have to make to journalism. It's not a 9-to-5 job. It's not a Monday through Friday job. You got to stick with the story. It takes you through weekends when there's campaigns going on. You work weekend and weekend and weekend to tell the story. And that's not because you have to, because you want to. You want to tell that story. You're passionate about it. You want to be there. You want to be on page one. You want to make a difference. You want to have impact. There is so much when you think about journalism. And again, this is something that gives me hope because the technology has enhanced the power of journalism and our journalism. And it's not just mainstream media, but it's anybody in this room who's on Facebook or Twitter. I oftentimes like to talk to journalism professors that I know and ask them, what has more impact? What has more global impact? Would it be like a 4-part, text-heavy newspaper series, or would it be I used to say a 6-second Vine video, but now I say a 60-second Instagram video because that's the new thing. What has more impact, the big project in the paper or the 60-second Instagram video? And inevitably, people will say, well, definitely the long-term investigative project in the paper. I said, well, what if it's a story about childhood malnutrition, for example? And you've got a series of stories with charts and graphics and experts, but then somebody takes a 60-second Instagram video of a child going to bed hungry, and it gets millions and millions of views. What had more impact? What changes things more? What puts the spotlight more? So the power of our journalism today is greater than it has ever been. And you can do it right now. So passion, hard work, and a desire to change things and to experiment with new platforms to have more reach and more power to your writing and your journalism.
If I could just add one thing, and now I really am consigning myself to seeming old and out of date. I think whether it is journalism or politics or law or accounting or anything else, I would say that a real commitment to learning the craft, to not getting from, to going methodically from point A to point B to point C, and learning how people who do stuff well do it, and kind of committing yourself to learning how to do it really well, even though there'll be people around you who will say, in effect, I have a way where we can just kind of do this and maybe blow past, those standards, this standard or that standard. I think that generally, if you'll permit me, that focusing on learning the craft really solidly, even though it'll take extra time, even though it'll be long days and nights and weekends, is probably, as a general rule, the safest way to go.
Over there, yeah.
So how do both of y'all feel on the impact of social media? Is it more positive or more negative today?
I didn't hear the question.
Could you hear it?
Oh, okay. Sorry. So how do both of you feel on the impact of social media? Is it more positive today or more negative?
The impact
Did you hear
of
me?
social media.
Oh, okay.
On journalism or in general on communications?
The impact of social media on the public discourse.
On the public discourse
Yes.
in general. I think there's a good and a bad. I think that social media is an incredibly powerful tool that can be a good thing, that we can use to be a journalistic tool and a vehicle to reach a lot of people instantaneously. you don't have to wait for tomorrow morning's paper to come out. You can go out right now. We can live tweet right from here. We can start, a discussion right here, right now. That's good. The bad part of it is that, it can ratchet up the rhetoric, because when you are on the internet and you're in social media, you can be anonymous and you can say things that you would never say face to face. You'd never say those things face to face. So I think that that is a downside. So again, we have to conduct ourselves in a way that keeps the conversation going, so we're hearing other people and we're engaging and we're doing it in a way that we would do face to face. We may be talking to 1 million people on social media at that moment instead of one person, but I think that you need to think when you're writing. I always tell my reporters, they ask about Twitter guidelines, and we've spent a lot of time on social media policies. I've disciplined people based on it, but it is, I think, I tell them, pause. Just pause before you tweet something. Think about what it is you are saying and what the impact of it's going to be. And I think that's just very simple advice.
So the question I have is a language that is being used in other prints, as you mentioned before, accusing a politician of lying, contributing to more of a divide? And in that sense, is it also creating a effect on the referendum effect of President Trump's election in 2016 having effect on the 2018 midterms because of what the press is doing?
I didn't understand it. Do it again.
So, let me get it back up. Is the language that is being used in print, as you mentioned, accusing a politician of lying, contributing to more of a divide between the consumers and the print and politicians?
Well, I am very worried that the normalization of the language that is used is horrifically, it's just cancerous. And now, the lows keep getting lower, and therefore I fear are destined to get even lower as a number of different things happen in no particular order of importance. Number one, people see this kind of, the horse face accusation, or the attacks that are, frankly, in my view, coming out of this White House, which are unprecedented. I worry about the normalization of not telling the truth. I worry about the natural course that will take. That politicians, that you've seen some of this stuff in 2018, you'll see more of it in 2020, that all of us as citizens and politicians and the media say, well, if this is perfectly okay, then this is the new normal. And let's now, let's see what comes next. I do fear that there is a kind of a downward spiral that for me is hard to see reversing. And so, yes, I'm extremely concerned about the language. And by the way, it's not just, in one direction. It's on both sides. I remember, for instance, when 9/11 occurred, and I'm a Democrat, and George Bush was blamed for 9/11 as though he was supposed to somehow have prevented it from happening, let alone 8 months after he took office. And then there were quickly inquisitions about how could you have let 9/11 happen. And then there was an effort to try to keep 9/11 from happening again by passage of the Patriot Act, whereupon the left decided that Bush and Cheney and others were, war criminals and the like. And you wondered, and I'm somebody who's, as I say, a Democrat, how unfair is this? You're attacking him from not preventing something that he couldn't have prevented from attacking, that actually developed under his predecessor's administration, a Democrat. You're conducting an investigation into how we could have allowed it to happen, and now when he passes legislation aimed at trying to prevent it from happening, you're blaming him for that too. So I see this as a two-sided monster, where the vitriol, the dissent in terms of language, metastasizes on both sides. And personally, I hate to be a downer about it, I don't see how this plays out in a good way. There. I hope everybody's cheered up.
Oh, hi. My question is, as you mentioned before, talking about how people on Fox and CNN, people only get called back if they're interrupting and basically yelling. Do you really think that this is going to become like the new standard on not only presidential debates, as we've seen with Trump and Clinton, but also just from now on, that's the new standard of things?
Yelling questions at
yeah,
press
interrupting, being
conferences.
rude, using language, names.
I mean, I think that has something that has always occurred, really. I mean, I think that if you go back and look at Ronald Reagan, you know, and he would always do this. They couldn't quite hear them if you didn't want to answer the question. So I think that it is something that has always been, the press corps has always done that. You know, the press corps is oftentimes roped off, confined, you know, to an area, and they have to sometimes shout to be heard and get that question out. But I do think that there's a certain theatrics that goes with what's happening today. And so each time Sarah Huckabee's out there giving a White House press briefing, it's tune in for the entertainment hour. It's, you know, what is Jim Acosta going to ask today, and what is she going to say, and she really gave it to that guy. And so it becomes theater and not so much trying to get to the truth. And so I think that occurs today.
On that question, the answer, as far as I'm concerned, is yes. It is absolutely the new standard. I mean, it has. I don't remember the last time when one could turn on CNN, MSNBC, Fox, and you didn't have, you know, 24/7 every single block of time covered by people who were yelling at each other or who were disagreeing snarkily with one another. That is obviously what the producers have decided we all want. There must be all sorts of marketing research which bears that out. So unfortunately, your question, is that the new standard? I believe it is. And in terms of presidential debates or debates, that kind of language being employed, I think the answer, unfortunately, must be said to be yes. That, I think, is the new normal.
Yeah, I mean, I drive home at night, I listen to CNN and Fox on Sirius Radio, and inevitably it's parallel universes, people taking totally different positions, yelling and screaming. And after about 20 minutes of listening and shifting back and forth, I end up with classic rewind, listening to like the Beatles or something because there's only so much of it you can take, and when you can't sit in a room with someone yelling and screaming and sustain that for very long. Nobody wants to do that.
And the only thing I would say about that, if I can just say, is that that's clearly right. Nobody can take it. We all say, we can't take it, this is loathsome, get me out of here. But somebody, somewhere, in news organizations across the ideological spectrum are looking at research which says that's what people will tune into. So there's the ultimate statement there, it seems to me, I fear.
You've had a question.
Thanks for coming. So I have just a quick two-part question, and I'm not sure if you'll agree that they're related or not. But first, I just wanted to ask how you think structural problems facing the news industry, particularly I'm sure a lot of folks here have had struggles getting internships, especially a paid internship, and how that may factor into a lot of the more philosophical questions you've been asking about distrust in the media today. And the second is about kind of who's in favor of, well, particularly which partisans are in favor of free speech now compared to like 40 years ago. So I'm thinking of people like Tucker Carlson on Fox suddenly being these champions of free speech, almost in like an ethno-nationalist way, and how you think that switch happened where now a lot of young people have pretty probing questions about the limits of free speech.
Well, I'm going to turn over the First Amendment question, the free speech, to Jeff, who is an expert in the First Amendment and practice of First Amendment and media law. I happen to be a First Amendment purist as a journalist, so I believe that there should be very few limitations on First Amendment practice, but I think that, or free speech. But I think that again, it's interpretation of what that means. It doesn't mean that you can incite violence, that you can spread hate, that you can attack in a way that does incite violence. So I think there are limitations on what the Founding Fathers meant when they outlined the First Amendment and the right to publish and to speak and to assemble. As far as the structural changes in the industry, I mean, I think there's no doubt that things are tighter financially, that we're all struggling, that we're all looking for new ways, and that's exactly why is to give the people what they want or what we perceive they want, if we can hold on to a niche audience. I think that, I try to open up as many positions as I can for young people to come into the newsroom, whether it's on an internship basis or volunteer basis, just to be in the newsroom, just to see how things work. We've had Franklin Pierce students in there. Jeff's brought some of his students from Brown in, just to sort of soak up the atmosphere. And I'm always amazed at how impressed young people are, or how excited they are by it. But what I see is just basically an office, people on the phone. But it's something about the industry that makes people move toward it, makes certain people move toward it.
Yeah, I have a good news, bad news story about that. It's actually a case in which, like many, many other instances that in the Boston area and in New England, throughout New England, the Herald made a dispositive difference in bringing justice about. If you'll permit me to be melodramatic about it, it was actually a case, and I think I'll not name the college, but it was the day or so after the 2016 election, and a couple of students had been accused of driving onto another campus and having shouted "Make America Great" and unleashed a Trump flag, and had been accused of doing some other things. The president of that college promptly announced that it was despicable that this had happened. They had done these things, just assuming that they had done the serious things, really serious things that had been done. And there was a wave of social media and other media essentially concluding that these kids had done stuff which they had not done. I got a phone call from a Republican, imagine that, asking if I would represent his son in this case, and I did. I probably shouldn't do this in a live streaming context, but it's fair to say that my wife of 31 years has never been anywhere near as angry with me as she was when I took on this case, representing this kid who had been a Trump supporter and unfurled a Make America Great flag. I said to her, if I were representing somebody, a Nuremberg defendant, you would be less upset at me than this. Well, it's interesting the way the First Amendment divide played out, right? For a lot of people on the left, people who didn't like Trump, they had no concern whatsoever about the fact that the First Amendment rights of these kids to shout, "Make America Great," and unfurl a Trump flag were being trampled on. As far as they were concerned, the First Amendment was all well and good unless it involved people on the opposite political side expressing their speech. So it was a case, the point that I was trying to make in the connection with this case is that, you're all for the First Amendment except for people who are Trump supporters. So one does find that people's sentimentality about the First Amendment may get affected by what side of the aisle the particular context involves.
And you see that on social media, right? How many times are you on Twitter when somebody says, delete your account, right? Delete your account, get off of Twitter. And then hundreds of other people are doing the same thing. It's an attempt to suppress speech. And I take that very seriously. And so, I think that whether it's the First Amendment traditionally in print or whether it's on social media, it's the same standard, that we should not suppress speech unless it is hateful, inciting violence, or meet some of those other more critical standards. But we're a society where sometimes omission or suppression can be worse than what is said, and I think we have to bear that in mind. So.
Thank you. The mission of the Marlin Fitzwater Center for Communication is to challenge perspectives and help people find their voices in the public discourse. And I think that this was an hour that went a long way to helping us meet that mission. And so thank you. Please join me in thanking our guests, and thank you.
We're going to go to our dorm room now, and then we're going to resume this later on in about an hour or so. But thank you all very much. Great questions.